Welcome to Everything Rugby League, the podcast. Today's guest is one of the most influential voices in rugby league journalism, Martyn Sadler, editor of League Express magazine and longtime champion of the sport, both in the UK and internationally. Martyn, pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks, Keith. It's a real pleasure to join you. And, we've got Oz-like weather in England at the moment. It's coming up to 20-odd degrees. We're heading into summer, mate, so it's a good time to join you just when you're heading the opposite way, aren't you? You're going into winter, I suppose, now. So, but it's great. It's great to come on board, and I'm sure we'll have a great discussion.
Yeah, it was actually really cold today. I put the heater on for the first time in maybe 6 months. But anyway, I'm sure our listeners don't want to hear about my struggles in the cold today. Stuart, how are you going, my friend?
People like you think that it's cold when it's 20 degrees, don't you? So,
That is cold.
Yeah.
Stu, how you doing, my friend? I hear the women's state of origin on track to break the crowd record again, about 30,000.
Women's state of origin tonight, and they're looking for a record crowd, which is exciting. And by the way, I think we got down to 1 degree this morning. So just talking about the weather, but Canberra's a very different proposition to Sydney as far as coldness. But we'll get off that. Martyn, there's been a lot written and said about Super League, and even today, I don't know whether you saw Luke Keary's
gosh, yes,
which to me is like biting the hand that feeds you.
It certainly seems like that way to me. If Luke had been playing really well for the Catalans Dragons, I'd probably take him a lot more seriously. But so far, he's yet to shine.
Yeah, I thought it was a very strange outburst. But my question is, how would you rate the health of Super League in 2025 on and off the field, given you're a lot closer to it than Keith and I are here?
Well, like many competitions, it's got great strengths and great weaknesses. The product on the field is as good as it's been for a long time, in my view. The crowds are on the rise. And as you know, we've sold out 2 of the 3 Ashes Test matches that are going to be held later this year, including 50-odd thousand at Everton in Liverpool in their new stadium. The problem is that the game isn't paying its way at the moment. And, the Super League clubs last year probably lost between them something like 20 million quid, which sounds a lot of money until you actually bear in mind that in football, Leeds United, which is quite local to me, have just been promoted from the Championship into the Football Premier League next year. And their last set of accounts for the 2024 year showed that they lost £60 million as one club, which probably trebles the total losses in rugby league, for the same period. So, the problem, a lot of sports lose a lot of money. I mean, even Jim Ratcliffe, who took over Manchester United probably a couple of years ago now, said that, without the funds that he's put into that club, it would probably go into administration because it's losing so much money. And yet, it's generating amounts of money that we can only dream of. But it's not so much the money you generate, it's how you spend it and whether you make profits or losses. And the NRL is in quite a unique position, I think, at the moment, in the sense that it appears to be making money rather than losing it. And that puts it in a really potentially very strong position. Whether it wants to, I mean, I've been talking to a lot of people in the English game in the last couple of weeks about, the links with the NRL and what might happen. And nobody seems to know in what form any NRL interest, what form it might take. Does it mean the NRL buys a third stake in an organisation called Super League Europe, which is the company that all the Super League clubs are part of and partly own? Does it mean buying, or does it mean creating a brand new competition and enticing clubs to leave the RFL, which I think would be an absolutely disastrous thing to do personally? So, nobody's sure, and nobody seems to know what discussions have been held, if any, since the Las Vegas weekend when two of the most influential and wealthy people in British Rugby League, Mike Danson, who owns Wigan, and Simon Moran, who owns Warrington, they had discussions at that time with Peter Vlandis and Andrew Abdo. Nobody's, well, nobody's absolutely sure, it seems to me, what those discussions entailed. Everybody's keeping a bit quiet about them, in particular, Messrs. Danson and Moran, who are not known for talking to the media, unfortunately. So, there may well be some movement over the next few weeks. And I know a lot of, rugby league clubs are very keen in this country to get a closer relationship with the NRL. But at the moment, as I say, nobody's got any real idea of how that might work out in practice.
Yeah, I think there's still quite a lot to play out, hopefully soon as well, especially around those global TB rights. That's an interesting concept in itself. But before any of this was a possibility, really, the world's biggest sports management firm, IMG, were brought in to try and, quote, reimagine the sport. How do you think they're going, and have they lived up to sort of, the deal that they signed on for?
Well, they were announced in May 2022, which is now three years ago, and they the original press conference, which I was at, they said that their income from this deal would depend purely on the game generating more broadcasting income from wherever the broadcasting income might come. But since then, we've discovered that after 2 years, they were on a fixed contract that paid them 450,000 quid a year, which wasn't mentioned originally. And nobody's quite sure what they're getting paid for, because, as you obviously will know, they've created a grading system, which might be quite useful in itself. They looked at, all the factors that determine how successful, what makes successful clubs and so on. And they created this system of grading points for different facets of the way that you might run your club, which might include performance, but might also include social media activity and several other things. But apart from that, they don't seem to have done very much at all to me. I mean, I was assuming that they would come out with all sorts of ideas for popularizing the game using their own social media outlets, but they don't seem to do that. And they seem to have the feedback that I've got. I mean, the other thing they don't do is speak to the media about what they're doing. So again, it's very difficult to actually get much feedback from them of what they see their role as being. But it doesn't seem very wide-ranging as far as I can tell. And I certainly don't think that there's much that's happened in British Rugby League, that the positive things that you could say is down to what IMG has done. Certainly, the success in selling the Test series this year, I don't think IMG has had much of a role in that. So, but I stand to be corrected, because, I'd be happy for IMG to get in touch with me and tell me exactly what they have been doing. I'd welcome that with open arms.
Yeah. On another subject, Martin, there's been some media here and obviously over there that Nick Politis from the Sydney Roosters is in talks to buy Salford and rebrand them as the Manchester Roosters. Now, opinions on in the Southern Hemisphere, I've seen of like, oh yeah, this is a great idea. But then when you talk to people in the north of England, there's a lot more about, Salford and Manchester and where that sits. What are your thoughts on a potential rebrand of Salford?
Well, Salford is a significant city in its own right. It's the headquarters nowadays of the BBC's northern operation. The BBC are major broadcaster, and Salford has come up a lot in the world in recent years. And I think but it's very conscious as a city of its identity as opposed to Manchester. It's a bit like, New South Wales and Queensland in a sense. Salford is very proud of its identity. And I think, obviously, Nick Politis is a very shrewd and very able character, but obviously I don't think he'll appreciate the nuances of that relationship between those two cities, from his office in Sydney. And I think to rebrand, I mean, if he was going to rebrand the club, I would suggest it should be the Salford Roosters. And, if we're going to have a team called Manchester, it's a bit like, we might talk about Perth. If Manchester wants its own rugby league team, which is certainly would be an interesting idea, then it would be better creating its own team from scratch rather than trying to jump on the back of the Salford Red Devils. My view is that I wouldn't change anything about the identity of the Salford Club. The Salford Club is incredibly well located. For those people who don't know it, it's right virtually in the middle of the Manchester conurbation, the Greater Manchester conurbation, which consists of actually 10 local authority areas. And it couldn't be better located. All it needs is an owner who is prepared to invest in the club, who is, and it could be incredibly successful. But it's the only club in British Rugby League that started the season without a millionaire or billionaire owner, and it now has been bought by a guy who's actually a Swiss banker, but I'm not quite sure that he's bought it for the right reasons. I don't think he's actually a guy called Dario Berta. I don't think he's a rugby league man, and I think his main interest is buying the stadium and buying the land around the stadium, because I think he's a property guy, really. So, maybe he's not the right owner, but Salford, the Salford club is just waiting for somebody to buy it who can, steady the ship and then make it grow. It doesn't need a rebrand. It doesn't need to be moved elsewhere. It doesn't need to be moved into Manchester. And I think it's got a very supportive local authority, incidentally, Salford City Council. So I don't think it needs. I'd love to see Nick Politis buy it. I've got to say, if he was interested in buying it, but I would advise him very strongly against any form of rebrand. And I think I can speak. I think I can say with some confidence, Stu, that I'm probably speaking for the Salford supporters, or at least 99% of them, in saying that.
Yeah, definitely the original Red Devil, I think. Sorry, Manchester
Oh yes,
United.
they are. They've got a fantastic history, and you can't just sort of snuff it out. It's got to be built on rather than completely changed.
100%. This next question is a age-old question, but what more can Super League do to grow its fan base beyond its traditional heartlands? So that's a difficult one, because as a sport, we've been trying for a long time.
Well, it's interesting, actually. That's a really great question, and one I think about quite a lot, actually. And I'll give you, I'll give you, a bit of historical stuff here. Do you remember back in 1997 when we had the Super League war and the competition split into in Australia, the competition split into the ARL competition and the Super League competition. And the Super League competition, which was bankrolled by Rupert Murdoch News Limited at the time, they bought out English Rugby League as well and created the Super League competition in England. And that first year, there was a sort of international club competition where the English clubs and the Australian Super League clubs, played against each other. And we were shown up really badly because, the Australian clubs absolutely slaughtered us for the most part. And it was clear that we weren't on the same level. And the competition had been scheduled to run again in 1998, but because it was such a disaster in 1997, it didn't run, but that wasn't before the Super League fixtures in England had been created with 2-3 week gaps where this international competition was supposedly going to be played. And so suddenly they found themselves with a season with 2-3 week gaps, and they wondered how they were going to fill it. And I actually got a phone call from Gary Hetherington, who was the chief executive at Leeds Rhinos at the time, one of our top clubs. And he said, can you suggest what we might do about this? And I said, yes, what you need to do is take games on the road. Let's pick out some venues, throughout the United Kingdom, and take Super League games to those places. And we picked out places like Edinburgh, Cardiff, Northampton, I think, in the south of England, Newcastle, and several other places, and took Super League games on the road to those places. And they were very successful, actually. They got great crowds, and they did generate quite a bit of interest for our sport in those venues. So, in very typical rugby league style, they did that in 1998, and then never did it again. We're great at trying things out in rugby league, but then abandoning them without any good reason. Once they got back to normality in 1999, they actually ditched that idea for the most part, and didn't take games on the road. But my advice is always to do that. Take one home game. I mean, I think every Super League club should take one home game to a different venue, not its normal home venue, wherever that might be, and play games there. And suddenly, rather than having a regional game, you've actually then got a national game.
Yeah, we don't see too much of that in the Super League. We see a lot of, Penrith playing at Bathurst and Tigers playing
Oh
at
yeah,
Tamworth
it's a great
and
example.
Mudgee. And yeah, so that's a great answer,
Yeah.
actually. We're going to move on to what our listeners primarily
Well, the
listen
Warriors
to our
playing in
podcast.
Christchurch at on the Anzac weekend, for example. That was a great example, wasn't it?
Exactly right. And I've always, if you're going to use the name New Zealand Warriors, you need to be more than just Auckland, because New Zealand's more than just
Sure.
Auckland.
Yeah. Although I hope that at some point before too long, you'll have a second NRL team in Christchurch. I'd love to see it there.
Me too. Our listeners, we're primarily an international rugby league podcast, so the next few questions are international rugby league related. But which emerging nations do you believe are the best positioned to become regular forces in the international sphere?
Well, again, that's a great question, Keith. And I mean, obviously, you would tend to think that the United States must be a contender, mustn't it? Because if playing games in Las Vegas is going to have a long-term impact, then surely it must mean that American young men and women will start playing our sport and will ultimately feed through into a much stronger national side. And I'd certainly like to think that that would happen. But the other thing I would like to see, there's quite a lot of activity at the moment in various African countries like Ghana and Nigeria and so on. And I would love to see some emphasis placed on those nations. Obviously, there's South Africa as well. Um, I would love to see us encouraging more African nations to really take up our sport seriously, because there are some great athletes in Africa, as we've seen in so many other sports. And I think we've got quite a few players in the Super League of African heritage. Junior Nsemba, who I'm sure you're familiar with, plays
Yes.
for Wigan, and I think his family originally came from Cameroon, if I understand the situation correctly. So and there are, I'm pretty sure there are quite a lot more players who could be like him, from with that sort of background. So I would certainly love to see. And in my view, I mean, one of the things that's disappointed me is that we had a Nines World Cup a few years ago in Perth, and I'm a great believer in Nines Rugby League for developing nations. I would love to see for example, I'd love to see a World Nines tournament, but with a team, for example, representing Africa or even representing North America or South America, let's say, playing in that sort of a tournament. Let's use nines to actually broaden out our sport in a somewhat similar way, I suppose, to the way the other rugby code uses sevens to expand its player base.
Great answer.
Yeah, great answer. I used to love that World Nines tournament that was at the start of the year before the rugby league season in Australia. It was just very entertaining and
Absolutely.
and it gave access to a lot of people that to rugby league that probably neither were watching it or were involved with it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the frustrations for international rugby league fans, of which I'm one, is the higgledy-piggledy way, for want of another word, to the international calendar.
Is that a word, Stu?
How important is it for rugby league to have a consistent international calendar, and what would your ideal calendar look like?
Well, every other sport, as far as I am aware, well, not every sport actually, but most of the sports progress through their international competitions. And I mean, football has become an absolute behemoth, hasn't it? With the World Cup and
Yes.
all the various continental competitions, the Euros in Europe, which every country seems to participate in. I mean, the one sport that's doing incredibly well that doesn't have an international competition, but does have club competition is American football, which has expanded incredibly. But even then, I noticed there was an article the other day about flag football being in the 2028 Olympics in Los Angeles, and
That's right, yeah.
keeping it going when they come to Brisbane in 2032. The NFL again, the NFL, because of its unique governance structure, it is another sporting body that's able to generate very significant profits and can then invest them back into marketing the game. And I mean, the NFL now, I think, plays 4 games a year in London, for example, and those tickets for those games, they're played at Wembley or at Tottenham, and they sell out within hours. If you're not quick off the mark, you'll struggle to get hold of tickets. And those are just club games, like the Jacksonville Jaguars, for example. They play a couple of games in London, and they've invested so much in marketing their sport, and that's what we don't do much in rugby league. We don't, and our biggest failure has always been that we don't invest in marketing the game. We think that the game will sell itself, and it doesn't really. You've got to invest, certainly in this country at least. You've got to invest in marketing your product and bringing it to people's attention, and we're just not good at doing that, I'm afraid. But I think, and it's interesting, the international calendar. I at the moment we play international games just at the end of the season. So we have the club season runs in our case from February to early or mid October. In your case, from March to probably the end of September, early October. And then after that, if there's some room, we play some international matches. I mean, I think the Pacific Cup has been a great development in the Southern Hemisphere, and of course
Yep.
we've got the Kangaroos coming to us this year, which is going to be fantastic. But we need more, in rugby union. Contrast that with rugby union in our country. They play the Six Nations in February and March over 5 weekends. They then have a tour in June and July, so that, for example, the British and Irish Lions are coming to Australia this year, as you'll obviously know.
Mm.
And then in November, they have a series of autumn internationals where the Southern Hemisphere countries, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and even Japan and perhaps Samoa or Tonga or Fiji, come to the Northern Hemisphere and have a sort of a round robin against the Six Nations side. So they have three massive bites of the cherry. And in doing that, those international games allow them to finance the whole of the club game. It generates a fortune for them, and they use that money to promote their club game. Although not that successfully at the moment in this country, but nonetheless, we're very much the poor relations in terms of international competition. And to cut a long story short, I would love to see a mid-season international window as well as the international window at the end of the season. I'd love to see the month of July being devoted to. I mean, club football could continue to be played, but I'd love to see the month of July, being an international month as well. And I'll tell you
Mm.
something: if we were playing Australia in July as opposed to November in this country, I think we'd get a lot more Australians coming to watch them, because England is, great. It's great to be in England in July. It's not quite so great as far as the weather's concerned to be in England in November. And
Yes.
and of course, July is a time when a lot of people are on holiday and so on. And so I think, ultimately, if we could ever move to playing, having a second international window, then I would certainly propose, July as the best time of the year for that. I'm probably whistling in the wind though in proposing that, but you never know. At some point, people might listen to that and think about it. I noticed, by the way, the other day, Phil Gould. I was watching a thing a week or so ago with him talking on a podcast, and he touched on international rugby league and said, he could imagine a situation where international rugby league was taking place at the same time as club rugby league, which is, an advance, I suppose. And the great thing about that is, in a sense, is that you've got the Rugby League Players Association in Australia, which is keen to restrict the number of games players play
Mm.
during the year for understandable reasons. And that might force us into a situation where we do allow, um, you know, international matches to be played during the club season, and during that period, the players just transfer from clubs to the international teams, in order to fulfill that requirement of the number of games they can play.
Yeah, the only barrier I can see is obviously the clubs themselves. They've got a lot of obviously self-interest in keeping players in clubs and not getting injured. But I do feel like here that the tide's turning a little bit. I mean, I think at one time people just, clubs and NRL clubs particularly were not interested in the international game, but I think that's turning, and I think Peter V'landys has been a bit of part of that as well,
Oh, I think so.
because
Yeah.
he's come out in support of international rugby league, which I think is helping, and hopefully the others follow along.
Yeah, we've
Well,
got
you've got.
Troy Grant on next week, so I'll
Oh,
make sure
well,
we
give him my
ask him
best
about.
wishes when you see him. Yeah, yeah, give him my best wishes. The thing about the NRL and Australian Rugby League, your great competitor, of course, is the AFL, which is a
Yes.
remark. I think the AFL is a remarkably well organised um, body, and does some great things, for its sport. But the one thing that they can't offer is international competition. So if the NRL is
Absolutely.
ever going to really get ahead of the AFL, which obviously I'd like to see it doing, then international competition is one way of enhancing the profile of rugby league in Australia, and of course you've also got the possibility of having more clubs from New Zealand, the club that's going to come in from PNG in 2028, emphasising, rugby league sort of international dimension as opposed to um, the AFL, which is a purely Australian competition. As I say, a very successful one, but nonetheless, it can't easily expand into new territories because of the particular requirements it has of stadiums to play in.
Yeah, I won't repeat your answer to this next question to Troy, but what are your thoughts on the IRL and its ability to govern the global game?
Well, the thing about the IRL that strikes me is that it doesn't have the financial resources to be able to be effective as a global governor of the game. I know it's probably better financed now than it has been for many years, but nonetheless, it doesn't. It's just not got the financial resources that ideally it ought to have if it's going to really invest in developing the game across the globe, I suppose. So and I've got to say that I thought the International Rugby League governing body didn't show itself to be very effective in the way that it allowed the 2022 World Cup to go ahead in the form in which it went ahead, and lost a significant amount of money after it got £25 million from the British government to support the staging of that tournament, and it just didn't. It was a massive disappointment, really, in that we'd been told for several years beforehand that that tournament would generate significant profits, and actually it generated significant losses. And I don't think it was properly, you know, I don't think the people who ran that World Cup were properly brought to account by the International Rugby League Board. So that was disappointing. And then I was really disappointed to see the next World Cup being reduced in number from 16 to 10, which struck me as quite a backward step, because although the tournament wasn't an ideal one in 2022, I don't think you should ever take backward steps. And a 10-team tournament for a World Cup is actually quite a difficult one to sort of to sell in my opinion. With only 10 teams taking part, it doesn't look like a world competition to me, to be perfectly honest. So, and I'm sure a lot of other people would feel the same way.
Martyn, we've seen in recent years Tonga and Samoa, in particular, become a force on the international stage. Do you think we've fully capitalised on that?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, Tonga and Samoa have both toured this country, or both have come over to play test matches against England. Neither of them probably performed as well as they would have ideally liked to have performed. And we had fairly comfortable victories against both nations, and I thought the games might be closer than they were. But I think, I think having said that, though, it's been a fantastic development to see Tonga and Samoa, and particularly the Tongan fans have brought so much colour, to see them playing in New Zealand, and even when they were playing against New Zealand, where, at Mount Smart Stadium, the stadium seemed to be 3/4 full of Tongan fans wearing those red colours, and cheering them on. I thought it's been absolutely fantastic, and it's something that we need to continue doing. We need, Tonga, Samoa, Fiji, getting them all up to that level. Papua New Guinea as well. Hopefully in future, Papua New Guinea will be competitive with Australia, New Zealand, and England. And I think it's been absolutely fantastic, and I think the Pacific Cup has been a terrific innovation, actually, in your part of the world. And this year, I actually think it'd be particularly interesting because Australia won't actually be in it. The top three teams are going to be New Zealand, Tonga, and Samoa. And I think if one of those nations is going to win that tournament, obviously, and I think it'll be a great celebration, hopefully, of rugby league. When that happens, I think it's just a shame that it would be great to know what the fixtures were and so on, and when and where. But we always seem to be very late at putting this information out, don't we?
Absolutely, absolutely. One of my frustrations, yes, it sort of goes back to that whole international cup calendar thing, and the Pacific Championships Cup seems to be an NRL thing, and it
Oh
seemed
yeah,
to only get considered sort of post finals. But
yeah,
anyway,
yeah. Well, certainly in the other code in rugby union, I've mentioned the Six Nations tournament, and I can probably buy tickets for that tournament 3 years ahead. I mean, the
Mm.
fixtures are set out years ahead, so everybody knows you know when they're going to be and who against and so on. And that's just a luxury that we just don't seem to rate, do we? We don't really think about planning ahead all that much in our sport.
Yeah. NRL, they're doing a lot more for the international game than what they used to. I understand they at least partially funded Samoa playing against England in the tournament that you just referred to. But is there
Yes.
more the NRL can do for international rugby league and to help to grow the
Oh,
game?
I think that I mean the NRL is. I mean, a lot of people are saying the NRL should take over international rugby league, and there's a, a big argument in favour of that because the NRL is a money generating organisation. It's got the potential to pull off huge TV deals. I mean, we are the next TV deal for the NRL will commence in 2028, and one or two people over here are telling me that it's already a very clear idea of how much that new contract will generate and who it will be with and so on. Obviously, we know DAZN has taken over Foxtel in the last few months, and he appears to think that DAZN will be really quite impressed by a greater emphasis on the international game. And we hope that there will be bidders for English rugby league to bid the price up of the game over here. So I think the NRL there's a very strong argument for the NRL becoming more involved in international rugby league, and I think Peter Blandis and Andrew Abdo, from what they say, both recognise that, and I think there will be some developments, eventually on the international front. And I think they are very. I mean, Vlandis is one of those people who gets things done, isn't he? And if
pretty
he
much.
decides that international rugby league is an absolute priority, then he's not the sort of bloke who will sit back and wait for other people to act. I think he's the sort of guy who will, you know, give a lot of attention to achieving that aim. Particularly if
Mm.
he gives up the role that he's got with Racing Australia too, which
Mm.
is, I mean, there's a lot of talk about him giving up either rugby league or horse racing. I think most people would hope that he would give up horse racing, wouldn't they?
I hope so.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Speaking about the NRL, do you like the NRL approach to expansion that they're sort of in the middle of at the moment?
Well, I wrote an article probably a couple of years ago saying they ought to take in a new club every 4 years, and I sort of this was when the Dolphins came in, and I said the ideal way to expand is to sort of say put out a statement saying we're going to take the next club in 2027, and we're going to invite applications from all around Australia and beyond to fill that position, and then the next expansion will be 4 years after that, and so on and so forth. I'm not sure about getting two new clubs in such a short space of time, because I think it puts an awful lot of pressure on clubs to retain players and so on, and it makes acquiring players for the new clubs a very expensive operation. I'm also not sure about this business of moving the Bears to Perth. I tend to think that if you're going to set up a new club in a new location, you probably want to ideally have that club um, self-generated in a sense. Being totally identified with the new location, whether it's Perth, whether it's Port Moresby, or whether it's Christchurch or Adelaide or wherever it might be. I think the obvious expansion point for the North Sydney Bears would have been the Central Coast, where there's a stadium waiting for them to play in, and I couldn't see what would have been wrong with that. But I can understand why the old North Sydney fans. I actually went to one of the last North Sydney home games at North Sydney Oval in 1997 when I was in Australia at the time, and there were about 15,000 people there that day. And I remember thinking to myself afterwards, how crazy is it to throw a club out of a competition when it can draw 15,000 fans to one of its games? It just seemed absolute madness to me at the time. And the problem since then was a lot of the people who were probably at that game at the same time as me, eventually, because their club was thrown out, they actually switched sports to AFL or rugby union, and I think the Sydney Swans benefited enormously actually from the
I believe so. Yeah.
from North Sydney being thrown out of the game, out of our sport, and that was a mistake that I would hope would never be made again. But if the Bears were to move to Central Coast, I think that would be far better. But the decision now seems to have been made. So, I obviously hope it works, and I hope the people of Perth really embrace the Bears and can generate the sort of crowds that will make it hugely successful. And I hope the Perth club does get. I noticed Billy Moore set out 5 names the other day that he'd like the Perth club to actually get onto their roster. And if I remember rightly, there was Payne Haas, there was Jerome Hughes, and several others. It would be great to see those players playing for Perth. Whether they can get them or not, who knows? But it's very important that the Perth club hits the ground running and is pretty successful right from the start. Because when you're in a city where rugby league isn't the primary sport, you don't really want a team that's going to be struggling right from the off, do you? It needs to be successful, or at least moderately successful, right from the start.
Yeah, I agree. And I did have a question about the NRL's club's influence on the schedule, and we're going to replace that one because this topic is really fascinating with me to me. And the question is, what influence do you think these 2 new teams being introduced into the NRL will have on the Super League?
Well, that's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because I can certainly imagine a lot of English players looking very carefully at the idea of coming over to the NRL. I mean, Perth is a really interesting one because Perth is a lot nearer to England than Sydney or Brisbane are. Probably quite a few hours less on the plane. It's sort of almost like a halfway house. And Perth having been to Perth myself, obviously, I think Perth is is a beautiful city. If I were a young rugby league player, it's a place where I'd be quite happy to play rugby league, I've got to say. Everybody's saying that Brad Arthur, who currently coaches Leeds, is going to be the inaugural coach. That remains to be confirmed, but I think it's 90% certain that he will be the new coach. And I could certainly imagine him bringing a few players from England with him, whether from Leeds or whether from other clubs as well. And there's a lot of make no mistake, there's a lot of young talent in Britain that I think could cope with the NRL pretty well. We're seeing Matty Nicholson, for example, this year at Canberra, who's
Going great guns.
I think he scored 5 tries already, but he's playing very well for them. And, we've got other English players, obviously, although Dom Youngers was dropped at the weekend for the Roosters, wasn't he? Or is dropped for this weekend by the Roosters. So it's not all plain sailing. But, there are a lot of English players who could actually fulfill some of those roster spots for the new clubs. It'd be a lot easier for Perth to get them than for the new Papua New Guinea club, which, obviously Perth is probably a more attractive venue potentially than Port Moresby for English people who are not used to very hot weather. So, we'll see. I think there will be. I think if the people who are in charge of recruitment for Perth have got their heads screwed on, they'll probably get 4 or 5 English players on their roster.
Yeah, zero tax though. That's pretty juicy to me. That's like the French system, I think. But
Oh yeah. Well, there are all sorts of inducements that you can give, and certainly zero tax is a pretty good one. Having just filled in my tax return yesterday, it would be
is it
nice
zero
not-
accommodation costs as well? With them living in this?
absolutely. Oh yeah. No,
I assume so, yeah.
if the inducements are strong enough, people will go, won't they?
Imagine
There's
that.
no doubt
Yeah.
about it.
Next question though: is there a risk of the NRL becoming too dominant and leaving other regions behind?
Well, it already has done, really. That you're asking the question after the horse has bolted, and I think the NRL. I'm just a great rugby league lover. I have been all my life, really. So I'm just delighted to see the NRL being as strong as it is, and if it gets stronger, that's great, and it's up to us to make our game stronger in this country. There's no point whinging about how strong the NRL is. It's something we should all be celebrating, and I'd love to see. I mean, I was watching I actually subscribed to the Watch NRL streaming service because
Yep.
I wanted to watch the Anzac Day games last Friday, and they actually weren't being shown on Sky over here, which some NRL games are shown on Sky, but not all. And it was just great to see the sellout crowds at all the 3 Anzac Day games, and it was great to see the big crowds at most of the NRL games over the weekend, and I just hope that they it grow even bigger. And when you can sell out games, I've always said that the best marketing slogan in the world is a 2-word slogan, and it's the words "sold out." When you can sell out a game or sell out any event, so that people who haven't bought tickets can only look in from the outside, and you can say to them, "Well, I'm sorry, mate, but it's you've missed the boat here. We've sold out, and you're not." That I've always thought that selling out an event is the thing that helps generate more sales further down the track. So if you get into the stage where the NRL clubs can sell out the stadiums, like West Tigers sold out Leichhardt at the weekend for their very exciting game against Cronulla, and it's just great when that happens, and we need more of it, both in our country and in yours. And you need to plan the fixtures so that you can probably generate more sellout games, because by doing that you'll naturally raise the profile and get more people wanting to come to games.
I agree.
And of course, we had the record crowd for a regular season game over. Was during the Anzac weekend, wasn't it, with the Bulldogs and South, or was that the Easter?
No, that was the weekend before. Yeah, 65,000.
Yeah, the Easter weekend, 65,000, which is in AFL terms, they wouldn't think that's much, but certainly in rugby league terms in Australia, that's a great crowd.
Certainly, yeah, and we need more of them. That's the point. I must admit, actually, the one thing that depresses me about the NRL, and there's only really one thing that depresses me about the NRL, it's when you have a game at Accor Stadium and there are
Mm,
about
Oh,
10,000 people there
I
watching.
hate it.
absolutely.
I hate it
Yeah,
so
It,
much.
yeah.
I just wish that didn't happen. South
Mm.
Sydney, South ought to be playing at Alliance, didn't they, at the old
Yep.
Sydney Football
Absolutely,
Stadium?
absolutely. It's
And
crazy that they're playing.
I love watching the Bulldogs at Belmore, and it
Mm,
was great. It was great to
so
see
do I.
that massive crowd, against Souths. But and the Bulldogs are a amazing phenomenon. When the Bulldogs are doing well, half the population of Sydney seems to support them, don't they? So it's great to see.
Yeah, I won't include myself in that one, but
No, well, maybe not, but
um,
it's great to see, and it is true, by the way, isn't it, that I've actually just written an article for the new edition of our monthly magazine, which is Rugby League World magazine, about the influence of stadiums on crowds, and brand new stadiums um, in themselves tend to generate bigger crowds. We've seen it with Alliance Stadium in Sydney, with Sydney Roosters crowds above 20,000 on average. We've seen it with Combat Stadium, with Parramatta's
mm,
crowds, despite them not playing that well, are still holding up pretty well. And I'd love to see Canberra getting a new stadium,
yes.
because it just
Yes.
seems
Yes.
it seems an oddity to me. I mean, you're such a sporting nation in Australia, a fantastic sporting nation, and yet your capital city doesn't really have a great rectangular stadium, or actually a great
No,
oval, I don't think, does it? So,
no.
you urgently need, I think, and you need I mean, Ricky Stewart has said it, hasn't he? You need a CommBank Stadium in Canberra, and
With
I'm
the roof.
pretty sure that if you had one, the Canberra Raiders crowds would rise dramatically, and obviously that you'd probably play a football team there as well, and the Brumbies,
Yes,
presumably,
absolutely.
to sweat the facility. But I wish the people who I don't know who's in charge of the ACT, but I wish whoever they are, they would get serious about building a new stadium, holding about 30 odd thousand people, because I think it would be a great success.
I agree.
I can tell you the person in charge of the ACT, because I live here at the moment. Martin is a huge AFL fan,
Yeah,
and he actually pays a lot of money for a team called GWS, Greater Western Sydney, to come and play in Canberra and
yeah,
pretend they're a Canberra team. But
yeah,
yeah, crazy. But anyway, I'm glad you mentioned Rugby League World too, because that's a magazine that I contribute from time to time, and even send
absolutely.
you invoices at time, Martin.
You do,
Uh,
yes. Yeah, I always cringe when I get your invoices. No, actually, they're very they're really I'm delighted to pay them, and and you do a great job to it. It's great to have you on board. It really is.
Well, I
Thank you.
subscribe to League Express through the Pocket Mags app, so
Oh,
long
good.
time
Yeah,
fan.
Yeah,
thanks. Yeah.
yeah. It's amazing how many people do it. So it's a really popular way of getting hold of the newspaper, and people all over the world read it in that sort of way. I mean, just a different world, isn't it, compared to the world when I grew up? There was no
Yeah.
such thing as online newspapers.
No, but I'm still in love with the format. The format of a magazine, it still excites me. And you know, I write articles for websites and things, which is great and stuff. But to actually see it in a magazine is still special to me.
Oh, I
Mm.
think so. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. I'm very much an old fashioned guy myself in that sense.
Yeah. This question, Martin, you're probably best placed to answer this, given that you're overseas. Which NRL players do you think have had the biggest influence on the global stage?
Do you mean At the moment, as we speak now, which
Well, it could
NRL
be current, or it could be past.
Well, that's a really interesting question again. Gosh, I keep saying that, don't I? That's an interesting question, and they all are. But overall impact on the world stage, which NRL players? Well, I would say if you go back a few years, I think Andrew Johns was an incredible player, and he came to Warrington and played about 3 or 4 games for them at the end of one particular year. And people just sort of flocked to see him. He was such a magical player. And I still think he's a contender for being, up there among the best players of all time, certainly in the top 5. Alfie Langer did the same thing as well. He came and played a season at Warrington, and you'll remember that occasion when he was recalled to play for
Yes.
Queensland. I think it was 2001, if I remember rightly, to play for Queensland in the state of origin. And he actually had a blind when quite a lot of people in Australia thought he'd probably retired and probably didn't even realise he was playing in England. So, these guys like him, guys like Andrew Ettingshausen, who came to play for Leeds, in the off season from Cronulla, he was a massively popular player over here. But there are so many current players, NRL players who I particularly admire. Players like Daly Cherry Evans, I really have a very high regard for, although he's never played club rugby in our part of the world. Given that he's leaving Manly at the end of this season, I've said to a few people over here, a few club owners, for God's sake, why don't you sign Daly Cherry Evans? Because he'd be a great signing. He's such an eloquent guy, such a good spokesman for the game as well. And I think he'd be a great diplomat for links between the two countries. So but there's so many players who I think really would I'd say are great role models for our sport, actually.
Yeah, I dare say Catalan thought they had DCE for a small amount of time there, but maybe I'm making that up. But actually, we are coming to the end of our interview, and these next final questions, there's a couple of questions, are not rugby league related at all, but I'm absolutely super keen to hear what your answer is. Stranded on a desert island, you can take 3 albums with you. Which 3 albums do you take?
Well, I would take 3 quite contrasting albums to suit different moods. One of them would be an album of Ella Fitzgerald songs. I'm a great lover of Ella Fitzgerald, the great American jazz singer who's sadly no longer with us. I'd probably take a Beatles album, probably the Beatles' first greatest hits album, just to remind me of my long ago misspent youth listening to. I was a great Beatles fan in those days, and I still enjoy their music. And then I think I'd take an album of classical music, which I'm just playing in my car at the moment on Spotify, because I actually have quite a long journey to work each day, probably nearly 50 miles. So I tend to play a lot of music in the car on Spotify. And at the moment, I'm playing 2 pieces of classical music. One is Wagner's overtures, which you may not be familiar with, but there's some beautiful music there. And I'm also playing an album of the French composer Debussy's piano pieces, which are absolutely great. I'm a great lover of Debussy's music. So I don't know, I'm not that heavily into modern rock music, put it that way, which is why I've given you the answer I've given you.
The very different answers to Steve Mascott.
I bet. I'm sure. But Steve's would be just as probably actually more valid than mine because he probably listens to more music. I would think he's a great rock guy.
He certainly gets around to more concerts than anyone else in the world, I think. But yeah,
Steve gets around to more places. Full stop.
yes,
I'm continually astonished by Steve at the number of places he actually gets to, both to watch rugby league and to watch rock music. He's an incredible
yes,
veteran traveller, and great on him, mate. He's a great guy as well.
yes. Martyn, I'm going to ask a food question. What I need to know is your favorite cuisine and favorite dish.
Favorite cuisine is probably Thai food, I think, and the favorite dish is
Mhm.
probably a Thai green curry. But
Ooh, nice. Yeah.
that varies. That varies a lot though because it depends what mood I'm in. But I live in a small village, quite a small town in North Yorkshire, and we've got a Thai restaurant in the town, which is a really great. They do a really great job, and I'm one of their biggest customers. So, but I
Mhm.
do love Thai food, and but I love most things actually. There's not much food that I
Mhm.
don't like actually, Stu. And I always remember something that the late great George Foreman once said, which was that somebody asked him what was his diet, and he said, I'm on a seafood diet." And they said, "Oh, really?" He says, "Yeah, I see food and I eat it." And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
Great line.
Sounds like me.
that's my attitude, I think.
I love that line. But we're actually out of questions, Martyn. It's been an absolute blast from the bottom of my heart. Thank you so much for
Yeah,
coming
yeah,
on. We're both you and I are long-time listeners to your own podcast. And where can our
Yep.
listeners access
yeah.
League Express and Rugby League World?
Well, if you go on pocketmags.com, you'll be able to find both titles there. Or if you go to totalrl.com, our website, if you go on there and /shop, you'll be able to get hold of either title, and also our rugby league yearbook as well, which is still looking back at the last rugby league year last year, which is a great purchase in my opinion because it gives you every single thing that you could possibly want to know about the rugby league season in our country. So if you do want to know a bit more about British rugby league, that's the place to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, any final last words? I'll start with you, Martyn. Any final last words before we wrap this up?
No, well, it's been a pleasure to join you, and I'd be glad to do it again further down the track at any time that suits you. And wish you good luck with the podcast. I hope it's going well. I'm sure it probably is. And it's amazing in a way. If my dad was still here, he'd be amazed to think that I could be talking to two guys in Australia in the way that we're
Mhm.
doing at the moment. And in his day, that would have been obviously impossible. And he was the guy who really he was a rugby league fanatic, and he was the guy who, when I was a small boy, used to sort of lift me into the stadium over the turnstile and got me really interested in our sport. And you know, I bless his memory for that. And it's just been great to join you. I hope, as I say, wish you good luck for the foreseeable future.
Yes, thank you for those kind words. And Stu, I don't think you can top that, but throw the grenade at you. Any final last words from you?
No, I really enjoyed the chat. Genuinely enjoyed the chat, and I'm very impressed with Martyn's all-round knowledge of our game. It's just amazing. Not just the English game, but the Australian game as well.
Yeah.
His intimate knowledge is amazing. No, all I can say is please keep accepting my stories and paying those invoices, and I'll be happy. So,
All
Yeah.
right. Well,
And
you go, Martyn. You go.
uh, yeah. If you ever forget to send them, I'd be, I'd be quite happy. So don't worry. But yeah, no, great to speak to you, Stu, and great to speak to you, Keith. And we'll meet again, hopefully.
All right. Perfect place
Yeah.
to end it. Good night, everyone, or good morning, depending on when you're listening.